You know, it's funny how Greenland just keeps popping up in the news lately.
Yeah.
Remember a few years back when Donald Trump wanted to buy it?
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
The Greenlandic government was like, oh, no thanks, not for sale.
Right.
That whole thing really got people talking about Greenland, like what is its status?
Yeah.
But here's the thing that most people don't know. Iceland also has a history of claiming Greenland as its own.
Interesting.
So today we're going to dive into that kind of wild story. We're using this recent article from the Iceland Monitor as our guide.
Oh,
It goes into all these historical documents and figures, so get ready for a history lesson with a bit of a twist.
sounds fun. What I find interesting is that these Icelandic claims aren't just some random thing from the past.
Right.
They're really rooted in, like, a shared history and legal connections between Iceland and Greenland.
Exactly. And the article talks about this guy, Einar Benediktsson,
Yeah.
a poet and an entrepreneur.
Wow, interesting combination.
I know, right? He was super passionate about Iceland's rights to Greenland in the early 1900s. He even wrote this whole article called The Right of Greenland.
Okay.
And to get people fired up, he held this big public meeting. It sounds like he was really trying to start a movement.
I see. So using his platform to make a statement, what were some of his arguments?
Well, he was saying that Greenland had basically been neglected under Danish rule. He called it neglected to death, actually.
Wow, neglected to death. That's a powerful way to put it. It seems like his perspective kind of reflects that broader rise of nationalism that was happening globally around that time.
Yeah, for sure. So it wasn't just about Greenland. It was about a lot more.
Yeah.
But things got even more complicated for Benediktsson and his vision of bringing Greenland back into the fold. Because in 1931, a group of Norwegians actually occupied part of Greenland.
Oh, hold on. Norwegians occupied Greenland.
Yep, and you won't believe this, but Vidkun Quisling, the guy who later collaborated with the Nazis in World War II, was involved.
Wow, so this was more than just a small incident. It had some serious historical players.
Like a tangled web, right?
Definitely.
Right.
So what happened? How did this occupation play out?
Well, it's called the Eirik land incident. It shows just how messy things can get when you're talking about territorial claims and historical precedents.
You have to consider all those historical agreements and how they play into these disputes.
Right. And in this case, the Treaty of Kiel, which was signed back in 1814, becomes super important.
Okay. So how did the Treaty of Kiel factor into all of this?
Well, the treaty stated that Greenland, along with Iceland and the Faroe Islands, would stay under the Danish crown.
I see. So basically the Norwegians were going against this established treaty.
Exactly. And when the case went to the International Court of Justice, they ruled against Norway. The Treaty of Kiel was a big reason for that decision.
Wow. So this treaty really had a long-lasting impact on the region. It's like a cornerstone for a lot of their international relations, even today.
Definitely a key piece of the puzzle. But moving on, the article also talks about this scholar named John Duasson. He spent his whole life researching Iceland's claim to Greenland. Talk about dedication.
Wow. That's some serious commitment. What was the focus of his research?
Well, he dug into the legal side of things. In his doctoral thesis, he argued that Gragas, the ancient Icelandic legal code,
Oh, yeah, the Grey Goose Laws.
that's the one. He used that to say that Greenland was historically under, quote-unquote, common law with Iceland,
Okay.
basically saying that Greenlanders should have been considered Icelandic citizens, subject to Icelandic law. Can you imagine trying to argue that in court today?
That would be a tough case to make. But what exactly does common law mean in this historical context? Would it be like the legal systems we see today?
That's a good question. Common law, as we know it now, relies on past court decisions and rulings to guide future cases. But in Duasson's argument, it was more about a shared legal heritage between Iceland and Greenland, something that predates these modern legal systems.
Okay, so it wasn't quite the same thing. He was drawing on these ancient traditions to try and make a point about their historical ties.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty unique approach, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It shows how much he believed in the connection between Iceland and Greenland. And speaking of that, it seems like this Greenland issue stuck around in Icelandic politics for quite a while.
Oh yeah, definitely. The article mentions this member of parliament, Peter Ottosson, who kept pushing for Iceland to assert its rights over Greenland, even into the mid-20th century.
Really? So even decades later, this idea hadn't completely faded away.
Not at all. But then in 1953, things shifted again. Denmark made some significant changes related to Greenland, which really stirred things up.
Okay, what happened in 1953 that reignited the debate?
Well, Denmark changed their constitution. They gave Greenland county status within the Danish kingdom.
Oh, I see. So they were integrating Greenland more tightly into Denmark.
Exactly. And after that, Denmark went to the UN and said, hey, you don't need to keep track of our administration of Greenland anymore. Everything's good here.
So they were basically trying to solidify their control and say, no need for outside scrutiny. I bet that didn't go over well in Iceland.
You're right, it didn't.
Yeah.
It sparked a lot of discussion and debate within Iceland. Some people were furious. They saw it as Denmark just trying to take over Greenland completely.
Yeah, I can see why they'd feel that way.
Others were saying, let's be careful here. Maybe we need to think this through before we react, urging a more cautious approach.
Right. So a mix of strong reactions and calls for diplomacy. It shows how complex international relations can be.
For sure. And these different viewpoints played out in how various Icelandic organizations responded too. For example, the Icelandic Confederation of Labor, they organized protests against what they call the annexation of Greenland to Denmark.
Interesting. So they weren't just letting this slide. They saw it as a direct threat to Iceland's historical claims.
Exactly. They were arguing that Icelanders have rights and interests in Greenland that can't be ignored. Their reaction really echoed what Einar Benediktsson was saying decades earlier, about Greenland being neglected.
It's fascinating how those sentiments about Greenland persisted across generations. It shows how deeply this issue resonated within Icelandic society.
And it wasn't just a legal or political debate, There was a strong emotional component tied to it.
It was about more than just territory. It was about reclaiming a part of their heritage, their identity, their connection to Greenland.
And as for Peter Odysson, our determined member of parliament, he definitely didn't let this opportunity pass him by. He actually doubled down on his efforts in 53 and 54. He submitted even stronger proposals, calling for Iceland to be recognized as the rightful owner of Greenland.
Wow, he was really pushing for a bold stance.
He even suggested taking the issue to the International Court of Justice. He was ready to take on Denmark on the world stage.
That's quite a move. So what was the response to Oddisson's proposals? Did the Alþingi, Iceland's parliament, back him up?
Well, they definitely generated discussion, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But in the end, the Alþingi decided to take a more cautious approach. They acknowledged the historical claims, but ultimately felt that going head-to-head with Denmark wasn't the best strategy.
So they opted for diplomacy instead of direct confrontation? Makes sense. But what happened to those historical claims? Did they just fade away?
That's a great question, and it leads us into the next part of the story. Because even though Iceland chose a diplomatic route, those claims didn't just disappear. They became part of the complex relationship between Iceland and Greenland, like a chapter that's still waiting to be fully written.
That's a great way to put it. It seems like this story is far from over.
It really is amazing how all of this played out against a backdrop of major world events. When Benediktsson was first pushing for Greenland, World War I was raging on.
Right.
And then you have the Norwegian occupation incident just before the whole Nazi Germany thing. Makes you wonder how all that global turmoil might have shaped how people saw these Icelandic claims.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought experiment. Imagine you're an Icelander in, say, 1915, and you read Benediktson's fiery arguments in the newspaper.
Right.
Or maybe you even go to that public meeting he held. What are you thinking? What are you feeling?
Yeah.
Was there this genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, Iceland could bring Greenland back under its wing?
It's easy to forget that history isn't just dates and facts. It's real people living through those moments,
Absolutely.
And in this case, it's about this desire to reclaim something that some Icelanders felt was rightfully theirs. And speaking of reclaiming, that brings us back to John Dueson and his deep dive into the legal arguments for Iceland's claims. The fact that he used Gragas, that ancient legal code.
Grey Goose laws,
yes. He used them to argue that Greenland was, for all intents and purposes, an extension of Iceland. It was like he went back in time to make his case.
Dueson's work is a testament to the power of really digging into historical documents and legal scholarship. He pieced together this narrative that, while it might not stand up in court today, really does highlight how interconnected Iceland and Greenland were back then.
Right.
They had this shared legal system, these strong cultural ties, even a sense of kinship, like they were two branches of the same tree.
I love that analogy. And even as Greenland pushes for its own independence today, those historical connections are undeniable. And that makes me think about the future. What does all this mean for Greenland with its push for independence and Denmark navigating this evolving relationship and Iceland still holding on to these historical claims? Could things get a little well, complicated.
It's a good question. As Greenland gains more autonomy, it makes sense that they would start to re-examine their relationships with other countries, including Iceland.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe those old claims will resurface during those conversations. It's a good reminder that history has a way of, well, coming back to haunt us.
It's like a seed that was planted a long time ago and might sprout again when we least expect it. And speaking of things resurfacing, the article mentions that some Icelandic organizations had some pretty strong reactions to Denmark's moves in the mid-20th century, particularly when Denmark made Greenland a county.
Right, right. Remember those protests from groups like the Icelandic Confederation of Labor?
Yeah,
They saw that whole thing with the county status and Denmark going to the UN and saying, hey, no need to keep an eye on us anymore, as a direct threat to Iceland's claims. They felt like Denmark was just trying to brush their shared history under the rug.
so it was about more than just the legal arguments, right? It was about protecting this shared heritage and this sense of betrayal they felt.
Exactly. And their protests echoed what Benedictson had been saying decades earlier. It shows how this idea of Greenland being neglected really struck a chord within Icelandic society. Even though they eventually took a more diplomatic route, there was definitely this feeling of resistance towards Denmark.
It's almost like a family feud that's been simmering for centuries. And it makes you wonder how all of that historical baggage might affect Iceland's relationship with an independent Greenland. Could it lead to tension? Could it affect negotiations?
It's definitely something to think about. It highlights the importance of understanding historical context, especially when dealing with complex issues like this. The roots of present-day conflicts are often buried deep in the past, and while we don't need to dwell on them, it's important to acknowledge how the past shapes the present.
And that's why we love doing these deep dives, right? Uncovering these hidden connections and gaining a better understanding of how everything fits together. And speaking of connections, we need to circle back to Petter Ottosson. The article talks about how relentless he was in his pursuit of Iceland's claims to Greenland. He kept submitting proposals to the Alþingi and even talked about taking the issue to the International Court of Justice. Talk about dedication.
He really believed in Iceland's claim and was willing to fight for it, even on the world stage. His actions really demonstrate just how much this issue mattered to some Icelanders.
So what happened with all those proposals? Did they gain any traction in the Alþingi?
They definitely got people talking. Remember, the Alþingi referred his 1954 proposal to the General Committee, and while they acknowledged the historical basis for Iceland's claims, they ultimately concluded that a head-on confrontation with Denmark wasn't the most practical approach. They thought negotiations would be more effective.
So, in the end, they chose a path of diplomacy and pragmatism. Makes sense.
Right.
But what about those historical claims? Were they just forgotten?
That's where things get really interesting. While Iceland might have opted for a diplomatic approach, those claims didn't just vanish. They became this sort of, well, unspoken element in the relationship between Iceland and Greenland, like an unfinished chapter in their shared history.
It's like they were tucked away in a drawer, just waiting for the right time to come back out.
Exactly. And with Greenland pushing for independence, who knows? That time might be sooner than we think. It's natural that as Greenland takes more control of its own destiny, they'll start to reevaluate their relationships with other countries. And Iceland, with its historical claims, will undoubtedly be part of that conversation.
It's amazing how history has a way of surprising us, isn't it? Issues we think are settled can suddenly become relevant again, challenging our assumptions and forcing us to re-examine the past.
That's what makes studying history so fascinating. It's not just about learning what happened, it's about understanding how the past continues to shape the present and influence the future. And this story, with all its twists and turns, is a perfect example of that. It blends historical claims, national identity, legal debates, and even a bit of poetic passion, creating a narrative that's both captivating and thought-provoking.
I love that. It reminds us that history isn't just some dry collection of facts and dates. It's a living, breathing story that's still unfolding and affecting our lives in ways we might not even realize. And with Greenland's growing importance on the world stage, this story could have some significant implications for the future of Iceland, Greenland, and the entire Arctic region. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From these historical claims to the legal battles and even the emotional weight this whole issue carries. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to our listeners.
Yeah.
Why should they care about this seemingly obscure bit of history?
That's a great question. Iceland's claims to Greenland, even though they're not really being pursued right now, I think they show us something really important.
Okay.
They show how history and national identity and legal arguments can all get mixed up together, and sometimes they resurface in ways we don't expect. It's like a reminder that the past isn't really past at all, you
It's
know?
like it's always there,
Yeah.
lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. And in this case, that past could have real implications for, well, not just Greenland and Iceland, but maybe the whole Arctic region. Think about it. What happens if Greenland actually achieves independence from Denmark?
Right.
Suddenly, those historical claims, the ones that seem like ancient history, they could become a big deal again.
It's like a ticking time bomb, almost.
Well, maybe not a time bomb, but definitely a potential source of friction or maybe even opportunity. Who knows how an independent Greenland would view those claims? Would they see them as irrelevant? Or could they become bargaining chips in, say, negotiations with Iceland, maybe over fishing rights or access to resources? It's impossible to say for sure, but it shows how something from the past can suddenly become very real and very important in a changing world.
It really makes you think. History isn't just something we read about in textbooks, right? It has the power to shape the future of entire countries.
Absolutely. So for those listening who are thinking, okay, but what's the takeaway for me? I'd say this: don't underestimate the power of the past. Historical claims, even the ones that seem forgotten, they can come back to life in ways we never imagined. And they can affect everything from politics to national identity to international relations. History is alive, you know? It's not just a bunch of facts and dates. It's a force that shapes our world in so many ways.
It's a great reminder that to understand the present and to navigate the future, we got to understand the past. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Iceland's historical claims to Greenland, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Given how important Greenland is becoming on the world stage, and with its push for independence, what do you think? Could these old claims resurface? And if they do, how might they affect the relationship between these two countries? Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.